Hey, seventh grade. Hope everyone is well. I want to go over a few things for the week. We will have a Zoom test review on Thursday. Your time will be 11 o'clock. And then we will have the test ready for you on Friday. Let's see. Later on the week, I put it in the notes for Gradebook Wizard. Suggested film for you. I know a lot of y'all saw The Lost Battalion last year. It'd be worth it to watch it again. You can YouTube that. The movie's not on YouTube. It's, I want to say, maybe an hour and a half or so. It's the one starring Rick Schroeder. So wouldn't hurt you to watch that again, especially with studying World War One. I think most of y'all that watched it last year probably, if you only remember anything, you remember the pigeon. But be worth watching. All right. Now, we ended last time, we were talking about the Battle of the Marne, and that the fact that by about November, the Schlieffen Plan, wasn't going to work, and they knew that. So moving in, by November of 1914, the war had reached a stalemate, which basically means neither side has an advantage of what's going on. And all of the belligerent or warring nations now had to adjust their plans. Remember, both sides thought, or at least a lot of people on both sides thought, that this thing was going to be over by Christmas of 1914. They were very wrong about that, and they're starting to realize that. And they need to produce more, and to produce more, all the sides had to adjust their plans. So they needed to get large numbers of civilians to enter the war effort, to produce things like ships and guns, food, ammunition, and medicines in large quantities. This is going to be needed for a war that's not going to be over in a few months. Not to mention the increased numbers of casualties. Governments then really started to ramp it up to get more people involved. Governments used propaganda to portray their enemies as beastly and inhuman. And propaganda is a term in your notes that you'll need to know, is ideas or rumors used to harm an opposing cause. All right. But these things are going on. We're going to talk more about casualties as we move through this and we get to the end. We talk about the actual effects. But the casualties here were staggering. A large reason is because the advancement in weaponry. Just for an example, if you had 200 men charging at you across the field, and a few guys that are in pretty good defensive positions, and they have machine guns, those guys can mow those 500 down. And that's just one of many different examples of weaponry that didn't exist 100 years before. But by early 1950, the war on the Western Front had become a war of attrition. And that's a war of attrition where each side tries to wear down the other by constant attacks. And it just kind of sunk into trench warfare at this point. And soldiers dug trenches, which are ditches. Most of y'all have seen this on TV, seen pictures in your book, seen going back to the Lost Battalion movie. You'll see them in the trenches, the ditches. And they had eventually, two parallel trenches stretched for about 500 miles of unbroken lines from the North Sea, or from Switzerland to the North Sea. That's a long way to have unbroken line of trenches. But all the territory between them were known as no man's land. You'll need to know that. So between your trench and the enemy's trench, the land in between the two trenches is no man's land. And landmines and barbed wire protected those areas. So it wasn't just simply going across to attack the other side in their trench. You had to get through barbed wire. You had to hope you didn't step on landmines. Can't imagine doing that. But one of the terms I put in your notes, over the top. When you're going over the top, soldiers they're charging out of their own trenches to attack across no man's land at their enemy. So they're going over the top of the trench, going out to attack. So you'll need to know that term, going over the top. One of the battles you see there at the bottom of your notes, 1915, the Germans introduced poison gas as a new weapon. So this is another way of defeating or damaging your enemy. What you'll need to know about that was that the gas was delivered from cylinders. They would use the wind to deliver it. If the wind was blowing toward the enemy's trench, they could release the canister and it would push the gas across no man's land into the trenches. The gas would cause blindness, choking, vomiting, torn lungs, and even death. There was a risk to it. As you can imagine, if we were in a normal class, I would be asking you, just use your common sense. What's the risk to using the wind to deliver that weapon? And obviously it is, the wind changes direction. And if the wind changes direction while you release the gas, it blows back upon you and your men. And there were cases where that did happen. One of the bloodiest battles of the war was the Battle of Verdun. This is February of 1916. The Germans launched a surprise attack against the French at Verdun, which was a massive fortress in northeastern France. The French were led by General Philippe Pétain. Rallying cry was "They shall not pass," was his rallying cry. So Pétain was in charge there, made a name for himself. He'd already made a name for himself. And after 6 months, the Germans abandoned this attack. So this went on, the fighting, for 6 months. Both sides, the casualties here, going back to the casualty list, both sides suffered over 500,000 casualties, 500,000 roughly or more for both sides in this one battle. And yet it did go on for 6 months, but that is an incredible number of men lost in this, just for a particular battle. So you'll need to know the Battle of Verdun. Won't be the last battle. We're about to talk about another one that was important, that had massive casualties. The Battle of the Somme. July 1916, the British launched an offensive against the Germans at the Somme River Valley in northern France. This battle was inconclusive as well. There wasn't a clear victor, and cost the Germans around 500,000 men, and the French and the British around 200,000. One of the things you need to know about this particular battle is the British introduced the tank for the first time at the Battle of the Somme. So you need to know that. And although it made little difference at first, its introduction there, you do need to know Battle of the Somme, okay? The one thing about the tank, didn't make a big difference in the battle, but they were big, they were kind of slow and cumbersome. When if you look at World War I video of the tanks, they're not exactly moving quickly and doing the things that tanks World War II. But the other problem was generals on both sides of the war, when you saw more tanks being used, really at first didn't know how to effectively use them. So that was the other issue as well. I have that part right there in your notes. The Eastern Front. By the end of 1915, so at this point the war's been going on for over a year, Russia had lost territory greater than the whole of France. And they had also suffered massive casualties. So morale in Russia was not all that great. Russia needed something positive to stay in the war or get support renewed for the war. So in March of 1916, Russia launched an offensive against the Germans to little effect. And they did do a little better against Austria-Hungary a few months later. So they didn't really do much in these attacks against the Germans. However, we talked a little bit in that last section. These attacks, they did help in one way. The Germans had to transfer troops from the Western Front to deal with the Russians to the east. So that would weaken their strength on the west, fighting France and Britain. So that was not going well with Russia. Russia, we'll talk about in the next section, ultimately suffers horribly from the war, leaving the war. and then what became of Russia after the war and the years that followed, unfortunately for them, was pretty much a horror show. But we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. We're going to stop there. Tomorrow we'll pick up on talking about the battles on the seas during World War I. So we'll see you then.